could we talk about this morning that would go along with that thought? Do you remember Paul? And he was able to rejoice in tribulation. Why was he able to rejoice in tribulation? Because God sent him comfort, right? So even in the midst of tribulation, even when things aren't all we'd want them to be, we can rejoice in the Lord. I'm thankful to know that we can. All right. We are going to be back in the book of Psalms. We're going to be in Psalm chapter 55, but before you settle there, I want you to take your Bibles and turn to the book of 2 Samuel chapter 15. 2 Samuel chapter 15. We're going to touch on some things that I'm sure Brother Philip will get to as he's going through the life of David. But we'll touch on a little bit of this because I think it fits very well with Psalms chapter 55. Now, 2 Samuel chapter 15, let me read you one verse just to show you where David was at. Verse 30 of 2 Samuel chapter 15, and I want you to keep this in mind when we read Psalms chapter 55. I think it will help you understand the emotional state of where David was at. And David went up by the ascent of Mount of Olivet, and wept as he went up, and had his head covered, and he went barefoot. And all the people that was with him covered every man his head, and they went up weeping as they went up. Now, what kind of picture does that draw in your mind? They're going up the mountain of Olivet. Sorrow, grief, deep grief. David, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Israel, is going up, head bowed, head covered, feet bare, weeping as he goes. And listen, this is no situation where there's some times when you read some of the stuff around like funerals and things, it's interesting when you study the history. They had paid people that would like weep in sorrow and throw this big thing, right, as a way of showing the grief and loss that was lost. That's not what this is. This is true, heartfelt sorrow. And as David goes up weeping, head covered, head bowed, barefoot, the people with him are going up in the same condition, and they are weeping. Now, you might ask, what has caused this? Well, 2 Samuel chapter 15 is the chapter that deals with Absalom's betrayal, and where Absalom comes in to take over the kingdom. And by the time you get to verse 30, what's been going on is that David knew it was coming, and without much notice, he gathered up some of his family and about 200 men, and he vacates the city of Jerusalem just in time as Absalom comes in, takes over, and then calls a guy by the name of Ahithophel, who, by the way, is one of David's closest counselors. And I think we're going to find that from Psalms 55, not just a counselor, but someone he considered a close friend. Matter of fact, in verse 31, as David is going up this hill, weeping and mourning and head covered and bare feet, it says in verse 31, and one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now, David is in great sorrow. His own son is taking over the kingdom. He has had to flee, and he's had to flee, it seems like fairly quickly. And, man, he is in great mourning. The kingdom is uncertain at this point. His own flesh and blood is the one that's taken over. And as he's already in that state of great despair, he's told that Ahithophel is the one that has been helping Absalom and is a co-conspirator to take over the kingdom. And David does in that moment what all of us should do when we're faced with something like this, or honestly anything. He immediately prays to the Lord. And now, in Ahithophel's case, his prayer to Jehovah, right, O Lord, all caps, turned the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Now, why would David need to pray that the counsel of Ahithophel be turned into foolishness? Well, I want you to turn over to 2 Samuel chapter 16. Turn over there and go down to the very end of the chapter, verse 23. And it says in verse 23, "And the counsel of Ahithophel, which he counseled in those days, was as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom." This verse describes that Ahithophel was a man of great wisdom, and that when people heard his counsel, it was as if he was getting these things straight from God. Now, it's interesting to me because many times when you look in the New Testament, you look at prophets, priests, and other counselors, the Bible may actually say something like, "And the Lord told Nathan," right? Hey, listen, when Nathan went to King David with his message, he literally had heard from God. With Ahithophel, it says, as if a man had inquired at the oracle of God. Brilliant man. When he gave counsel, people listened because this guy was smart. This guy was wise. And the counsel he gave David, they said, man, it's like this guy's getting his messages from God. The messages he gave Absalom, I mean, it like, yes, this must be. Because this guy, he's got it. And when David heard that Ahithophel was with Absalom, he had one thing to do and one thing only. Lord, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Listen, David understood how wise Ahithophel was. He knew it. And I think we get from Psalms 55, which is believed to be about this time, believed to be written about this event, they apparently were fairly close. Now, the Bible doesn't specifically call out Ahithophel in Psalms 55, but the context of it fits very well into what we're talking about. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into this because I know Brother Philip's going to get to this and talk about this. But David is going up this hill. He's under great mourning. He hears that Ahithophel is on Absalom's side. He immediately prays that the Lord would turn the foolishness into, or the counsel into foolishness. Now, you find as you continue to go through this, though, the Lord answered David's prayer. And he answered David's prayer in regards to a guy by the name of Hushai, who was also a counselor of David, a friend of David. And it went something like this, and we're not going to read it for time's sake. But when David prayed this, that the counsel would be turned to foolishness, Hushai shows up. And he wants to go with David because he's a true friend of David. And he wants to go with him. And David says, no, you know what? You would better serve me by going back and what? Try to counteract the counsel of Ahithophel. Hushai was an answer to David's prayer. And there's a couple other guys there, some priests, and they're going to collaborate a little bit, and they're going to give some warnings out to David when they hear some news. Now, before Hushai is able to make a difference, there is something that happens. Ahithophel gives Absalom some counsel, and he says, you go set up a tent up on the top where everybody can see it, and you take the concubines of David that he left behind, and you go in unto them, and you defile them. In the front, and basically he tells them to do it in a way that the city will see it and know it's happened. And there's some indication here that he's showing them in regard to, listen, you make a point that you're in charge, that you disdain your father, and basically there's no reconciliation going to happen, right? I don't doubt, I read one commentary that made, this isn't mentioned in the Bible necessarily, but one commentator made he commented on it and basically said, it's pretty wise counsel for Ahithophel, even though it's disgusting and horrible. But you think about if there were people in the city that were still trying to decide whether they were going to follow Absalom or follow David, maybe, well, Absalom's in charge, but what happens if they reconcile and I have sided with Absalom? Man, the wrath is going to come down on me. Well, Absalom is making it really clear with his action. There will be no reconciliation, right? I am here to stay. So Ahithophel has done that. But then what happens is Ahithophel actually comes along, and you're going to see a lot of this in chapter 17. It says, moreover, Ahithophel said unto Absalom, let me now choose out 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue after David this night. Now, he is willing to go himself. He isn't saying, gather up a bunch of men and send somebody. He's saying, gather up a bunch of men and I will pursue after him. Now, there is some indication. I think it's pretty good indication. Others don't think so. There is indication that Ahithophel is actually Bathsheba's grandfather. And if you think about the situation with Bathsheba, right? David committed adultery with her, had her husband killed, and all this other stuff. There are some people that would indicate, and I don't necessarily have an issue with it, that Ahithophel is basically taking out his revenge on David for what happened to Bathsheba and her husband. The Bible doesn't say that. I think it's a perfectly good explanation. There is indication that that is who he is. It's not a for sure thing. So here's what I would say. It's an interesting note. The Bible doesn't specifically say it. Be careful building up a little too much about why Ahithophel did what he did. I think it's perfectly explanatory. I think it's probably a good explanation. Bible doesn't say one way or the other. Okay? But what it does say is that Ahithophel is willing to go out. His feelings on this matter, he is willing to lead the 12,000 men to arise and pursue after David this night. He's saying, don't let any time go by. David has had to flee the city. Now is the time. Go get him. Go get him now. And I will come upon him while he is weary and weak-handed, and I will make him afraid, and all the people that are with him shall flee, and I will smite the king only. You understand what Ahithophel is saying here? And this is spoken as a man who would have known David. He knows that David has had to flee, spur of the moment, flee from his own son. I think Ahithophel knows the condition of David at this point. He knows David enough to know, hey, listen, I don't think Ahithophel would have been surprised to find that David is walking up the hill, head down, head covered, feet bare, weeping about what has just happened. David, he says, Ahithophel says, let's go get him because right now he's weak. He don't have a lot of men with him, and he's sorrowful and he's burdened over what's happened. He's weak. Let's go get him now. And I will bring back all the people unto thee. The man whom thou seekest is as if all return, so all the people shall be in peace. And the saying pleased Absalom well and the elders of Israel. He says, let's go get him. He's weak. He don't have a lot of people. We are going to kill the king, bring back the people. You will be for sure king. You want to be king, Absalom? Listen, we can't just chase David out of the city. We got to put him down. We got to put him down now. It says in verse 4, and the saying pleased Absalom well and all the elders of Israel. He has said it. And Absalom is happy with it. But isn't it interesting that even though Absalom likes it, Absalom says, call now Hushai the Archite also, and let us hear likewise what he saith. This is the guy that David sent back to try to undermine the counsel of Ahithophel. By the way, about the way that went, Hushai comes back to town. Absalom says, wait a minute, you're Dad's friend. Is this how you repay him? And Hushai basically says, I served the last king, and if I served him, why wouldn't I serve the new king who's his son? I'm with you. Now, Hushai, interestingly enough, doesn't even have to insert himself into this conversation. The Lord put it on Absalom's heart to say, well, what about that Hushai guy? What's he say? He knows Dad really well. Let's ask him. It says, and when Hushai was come to Absalom, Absalom spake unto him, saying, Ahithophel has spoken after this manner. Shall we do after his saying? If not, speak thou. And Hushai said unto Absalom, the counsel that Ahithophel hath given is not good at this time. For said Hushai, thou knowest thy father and his men, that they be mighty men, and they be chafed in their minds, as a bear robbed of her whelps in the field. And thy father is a man of war, and will not lodge with the people. Behold, he is hid now in some pit or in some place. And it shall come to pass, when some of them be overthrown at the first, that whosoever heareth it will say, there is a slaughter among the people that follow Absalom. He says, listen, you know your dad, and you know the men around him. Those are mighty men, and you ain't taking him without a fight. And it's going to be a bloodbath. And the people are going to hear about it. Now, that may be true of David and his men most of the time. What are David and his men doing right now when this is being said? Man, they're walking up the Mount Olive. Well, I guess they've already done this, but they have recently been in the condition of head down, heads covered, feet bare, bawling their eyes out. He goes on and he gives some additional counsel about what they should do. And in verse 14, and Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, to the intent that the Lord might bring evil upon Absalom. Now, some people might sit here and say, well, or Ahithophel's counsel wasn't very good. And Hushai's was, because listen, David was surrounded by some of his mighty men. And maybe what Hushai was saying was right. And Ahithophel was wrong. You know what the Bible says? The Bible says that Hushai said what he said because the Lord had the intent of undermining the what? The good counsel of Ahithophel. David was vulnerable. And if Ahithophel had taken 12,000 men at that moment, he probably would have found David. But Hushai stalled. Hushai's plan also got Absalom out in the field. And if you know the rest of the story, Absalom loses the battle. But the Lord, in this verse, you see the Lord answer the prayer of David as he is burdened and walking up that hill, weeping, and everybody around him is weeping, and he just utters the prayer, Lord, undo the wisdom of Ahithophel, make it as foolishness. And then Hushai shows up, and he sends him back. And at the right time and at the right moment, for some reason, Absalom says, oh, this is really good counsel. Let's ask this guy too. And then it all starts to unravel from that point. Absalom was in a rock-solid place. He had the city. He had the hearts of a lot of the people. He had a wise counselor. David was in a vulnerable, weak moment. And yet God interfered with their plans. And God delivered. Now, Ahithophel basically goes out and kills himself at this point. His counsel wasn't listened to. Being as wise a guy as he was, he probably knew what was next. He probably knew, okay, this isn't going to work. They're not going to get David. And he went and killed himself. Now listen to this. Let's go back and look at Psalms chapter 55. Psalms chapter 55. It says, a psalm of David, give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not thyself from my supplication. Attend unto me and hear me. I mourn in my complaint and make a noise. He lays out here, as he often does, Lord, hear me. Lord, I'm coming to you. I'm burdened. I'm weighted down. Lord, just hear me. Hear my prayer. Hear my supplication. And don't hide yourself from me. And he actually describes that he is mourning. I mourn in my complaint. And I make a noise. Remember, David was going up that mount weeping. And as he's going up that mount weeping, he hears Ahithophel is among the conspirators. And in that moment, he gasps out to the Lord to undermine the counsel of Ahithophel. I believe that is what you're reading about here. And he goes on, those first two verses are his opening statements about his prayer, right? He's telling us who he's talking to. In verses 3, 4, and 5, he starts to describe why he is coming to the Lord with this prayer. He says, because of the voice of the enemy, because of the oppression of the wicked, for they cast iniquity upon me, and in wrath they hate me. Now think about that. He says, listen, the voice of the enemy has risen up against me. Do you know what Absalom had been doing, by the way? He had been quietly undermining his father. He'd been building up a following. And now he's being chased out of town. He's being oppressed by the wicked. Listen, if you don't think Absalom's wicked, Absalom had some stuff that happened in his life that probably shouldn't have happened. But listen, Absalom is power hungry and vengeful. And he's a man that's willing to publicly go in to David's, like, however many concubines it was, I think it was 10, and publicly declare that he's taking his own father's concubines. That's the type of guy that is oppressing David. They cast iniquity upon me, and in wrath they hate me. I think it's probably pretty clear that Absalom hated David. Now, I will tell you without getting too deep, David screwed up a few times. And I have to admit, I can understand a little bit about why Absalom might not have liked some of the things David had done. David made some mistakes. But Absalom had grown to hate his father. You don't think so? Listen, this is not just about him taking over the kingdom. When Ahithophel says, give me 12,000 men, I'm going to go kill David and only David and bring everybody back to you, Ahithophel liked it. The Bible says he liked it. That's a good plan. I like my father being dead. He hated him. Ahithophel must have had a pretty deep hatred for David too. To be willing to actually be the one to go out and lead the men in this battle and to take David. That's personal. Remember, Ahithophel is a counselor. He's not the general of the army. He's a counselor. And yet he's willing to go lead the men to go get David. That's personal. It says in verse 4, my heart is sore pained within me, and the terrors of death are fallen upon me. As you read these words, think about that picture of David and those people going up that mountain, openly weeping. Fearfulness and trembling are come upon me, and horror hath overwhelmed me. His own son has chased him out of the city and wants him dead. Now, if something isn't going to fill you with horror, if that doesn't, I don't know what would. I want you to see here in the next 3 verses. So David has outlined why he needs the Lord to hear him. And in the next 3 verses, he describes to you his mental state and where he's at. He says, and I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove, for then would I fly away and be at rest. Listen, David the warrior, David the mighty in battle, has just said, you know what? I just wish I could fly like a bird and I would fly off somewhere and I'd just be done with all this. You know, the David that you usually think about would be plotting how he's going to get victory. He'd be thinking about the strategy for how he gets back into the city. You start to understand why Ahithophel's wisdom was actually, from a worldly perspective, was good. David was weak right now. David says, listen, the state I was in, if you could just give me wings, I would just fly away and be away from all this stuff. Verse 7, lo then would I wander far off and remain in the wilderness. He's not saying if I had wings like a dove, I would fly away to safety so I could rebuild and conquer. He's saying, no, if I had wings like a dove, I would fly far away into the wilderness and I would just stay there. You're reading almost the words of a man in great defeat. He's on the verge of giving up. He says in verse 8, I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and tempest. Man, I just want to be away. I just want to be done with this. That fits very well to that picture of that man head down, barefoot, weeping as he climbs up the hill, with a whole host of people weeping around him. But then in verses 9, 10, and 11, you see David picks up his prayer again. And he goes from explaining why he feels the way he feels and how he feels to what his supplication is to the Lord. And he says, destroy, O Lord, and divide their tongues, for I have seen violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go about it upon the walls thereof. Mischief also and sorrow in the midst of it. Wickedness is in the midst thereof. Deceit and guile depart not from her streets. This coming from a guy who had to leave his own city because his kingdom had been undermined. Words spoken here and there, building up Absalom, tearing down David. And now Absalom's able to come into the city and just take over. And David says, divide their tongue. Divide their tongue. Why did he send Hushai? Man, undermine the counsel of Ahithophel. Divide their tongue. Because the city's full of violence and strife and wickedness and deceit and guile. Deceit and guile bring with it that idea of lying and betrayal. His own son and one of his closest counselors have conspired against him. I hope you would understand why he would use words like deceit and guile. And this guy's been betrayed. He's been betrayed. And by the way, for this betrayal to work, it couldn't just be Absalom and Ahithophel. Absalom has turned the heart of the people to him. He's been betrayed. You ever been betrayed? You ever had a friend who did something that you didn't expect? Mistreated you? Did something? Listen, others have been through it before you. Do what they did. Lean on the Lord for strength. In verses 12, 13, and 14, he starts to describe to you why he felt this so bitterly. It says in verse 12, "For it was not an enemy that reproached me." Think about that. It was not an enemy that reproached me. Then I could have borne it. Neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me. Then I would have hid myself from him. You know what? He says, it wasn't the Philistines. It wasn't the Philistines. Man, if it had been the Philistines, I could have took it. They hate me. They're my enemy. I understand that. But it wasn't. It says in verse 13, "But it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide, and mine acquaintance." My guide and mine acquaintance. Ahithophel was not just a counselor, but he was a friend. It says in verse 14, "We took sweet counsel together and walked into the house of God in company." The king's counselor, but not just a counselor, somebody that they took sweet fellowship together. The person he's talking about in these verses is not just somebody that gives him advice. This is somebody that he's willing to sit down well into the night and talk through things. Lean on each other. Hey, listen, when David would go into the house of God to worship, he was by his side. We took sweet counsel together and we walked into the house of God in company. You see here someone who has come along beside and opened themselves up to you, and you've opened yourself up to them. You've shared deeply with each other. You've worshiped the Lord together. That's the person that betrayed him. That's the person that conspired against him. That's the person that had come to hate him. And now David picks up his prayer again in verse 15. "Let death seize upon them, and let them go down quick into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them." What happened to Ahithophel, by the way? Listen, his conspiracy didn't last much longer than Absalom taking over the city. He wanted to go after David that night. That night. Hushai said, no, we should do it a different way. As soon as Ahithophel heard that his counsel was not going to be heard, which, by the way, how soon do you think that would have been? Well, since he planned on leaving that night, it would have been that night that he learned it wasn't done. He immediately went home, set his house in order, and killed himself. Let death seize upon them, and let them go down quick into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them. Verse 16, as for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. That's exactly what he did. He heard the news. He asked the Lord to help. And the Lord delivered. It says in verse 17, evening and morning and at noon will I pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. Now, listen, the only time we see in this story where David prays to God is that one moment where he's walking up the hill and he hears that Ahithophel has turned against him. He prays then. But in the Psalms, you know what he told us? He was praying in the morning, he was praying at night, he was praying in the noonday. While David's going through this event, David just doesn't utter a prayer here and be done. David is continually going before the Lord. Morning, noon, and night. Morning, noon, and night. In verse 18, he hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many with me. That's interesting. By the time it's done, David does have many. But at the time he heard that Ahithophel had turned against him, 200 people. Now granted, they may have been some of the choicest 200 people, I don't know. But by the time this thing is done, David has an army. And the Lord's with him. Verse 19, God shall hear and afflict them, even he that abideth of old, Selah. He has great confidence that God is going to hear him. Because they have no changes, therefore they fear not God. He knows. Listen, he actually, I think, takes comfort in this. He knows that the people that are against him take no thought of God. They don't have any fear of God. They're unwilling to change. They're unwilling to repent because they have no fear of God. But David is taking comfort in the fact that he serves God and he knows God and that God has delivered him many times. And David does fear God. He knows those that are against him do not. He goes to describe in verses 20 and 21, he describes these men. He hath put forth his hands against such as be at peace with him. He hath broken his covenant. Now, if he is talking about Ahithophel here, remember, he says that they went in sweet counsel into the house of God together. They were close. The indication here is that David and Ahithophel had some kind of a covenant with each other. And not just that they had a covenant with each other, but David was at peace with Ahithophel. And yet Ahithophel betrays him. In verse 21 it says, the words of his mouth were smoother than butter. Smoother than butter. You know what happens? You put a little bit of butter between your fingers. Man, it's smooth. Your fingers, even though there's a little bit of friction right now when I'm doing this, not much. You put a little bit of butter in there, man, those things are my fingers are going to go slide real easy. He says his words were like, they were smooth as butter. Man, Ahithophel, when he spoke, you listened. And David, looking back on it now, seems to recognize that he was just biding his time. He was just buttering me up, getting me where he wanted me. Talking nice to me on one side, getting ready to stab me in the back with the other. It says, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet were they drawn swords. His words to me when he spoke with me of peace. All the while he was planning war. What he said soothed me as oil would soothe somebody. And yet, in reality, the whole time he had drawn swords. Even Absalom, by the way, seems to have kind of came up to his father there toward the end and made some reconciliation a little bit, and then quietly went off and started building himself up and undermining his father. In verse 22, this is advice. Listen, if you've been faced with troubles, trials, people that have betrayed you, people that said one thing and did another, or were saying things just for their own benefit, you know what David says here? You know what David's counsel is? He says in verse 22, cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved. That's a pretty popular verse. It's one you're probably familiar with, one you've probably heard quite a bit. Understand that those words are uttered by the man who has had his friend and counselor and has had his own son buddy up to him, and all the while they're figuring out how they can overthrow him. Not just overthrow him, but kill him. The guy that's been through that is saying, listen, the best thing you can do is cast your burdens upon the Lord. That's the best thing you can do. You just cast those burdens on the Lord. The Lord will sustain you. If you don't know what the word sustain is, think about it this way. He's going to keep you. He's going to keep you in strength and get you through this. That's kind of what that word sustain would mean in this context. He's going to help you make it through this. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved. Verse 23, But thou, O God, shall bring them down into the pit of destruction. Bloody and deceitful men shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in thee. He says, I understand, Lord, your judgment will come. And they will be struck down. They will be struck down early. But no matter what happens, I'm going to trust in you. I'm going to trust in you. Now, Ahithophel was probably a little bit older. But Absalom, you could say, died in the prime of his life. When Joab took those 3 darts and thrust him through, and he died. Even though David was heartbroken over that, listen, that was also part of the judgment. I have no idea how that would be. I don't want to know how that would be. To have your own son betray you, and for your own armies to kill your own son. And Absalom deserved it. Listen, agree or disagree with Joab, the right thing for the nation was for Absalom to die. David was heartbroken over it. Even though Absalom, this shows the love and the bond of a parent to a child. Even though Absalom had chased him out of his own city, even though Absalom had taken his 10 concubines and publicly laid with them, he was heartbroken at what happened to Absalom. But listen, what happened to Absalom was the judgment that God sent down on him because of what he had done. And even in this prayer, even in this psalm, David is describing that God's judgment will come on the wicked. There is a huge range of stuff that goes on in this chapter. And if you ever try to divide it out, I've got it highlighted. Verses 1 and 2, David's declaring his prayer. Verses 3, 4, and 5, David is declaring why. In verses 6, 7, and 8, David is declaring his emotional state and why he just wants to be done. In verses 9, 10, and 11, he prays judgment on the wicked. Verses 12, 13, and 14, he lays out his accusation or his charge against the one that had betrayed him and how close a friendship that was. In verses 15, 16, and 17, he again calls on God to judge, and he declares that he will be praying to God day in and day out. In verses 18 and 19, he describes again how the Lord would deliver. In verses 20 and 21, he again describes the deceit of those that had risen up against him. And then he gives this great advice about casting your care because the Lord will sustain the righteous and will bring judgment on the wicked. Listen, I don't know that you and I will ever go through, I hope we don't, ever go through what David went through here. But we'll have our own problems, and we'll have our own trials, and we'll have our own troubles. And they may be small, or they may be really, really big. But David's words should ring in your ears when you're faced with those things. Cast your burdens on the Lord, and He'll sustain you. Remember that. Remember that. Cast your cares on the Lord, and He'll sustain you. All right, Brother Philip, if you would come and lead us.